sexy guys do. Explore what soul and their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, the thing I'm hoping that we'll figure out this week is something I've been hearing every now and then within the news, which is that the water table is dropping throughout the world. That sounds kind of alarming. It presents the prospect that we might run out of water. And, so much of our lives is dependent on water to drink, water for irrigation, water for washing our clothes and cooking. And so this would seem to present a pretty existential risk, like people could die, society could collapse. And yet it seems like almost nobody's talking about it. So I've always wondered how real the risk is, how big a danger this actually is. And rather than doing the responsible thing and looking that up myself, I instead asked you to do it for me so I could just recreate and watch Netflix in the meantime. So I'm looking forward to listening to you and hearing what you learned.
Yeah, it is weird that this one is not in the press more, It ought to be front of mind, but it isn't. And I don't really understand why. There's certainly a lot written about it. It's just nobody's talking about it. So I often start with a short answer before I get into the extended answer. And my short answer to your question about whether water scarcity is an existential problem is that it's already an existential problem for many people living on Earth. According to the UN, in 2022, 2.2 billion people lacked safely managed drinking water, including 700 million who lacked a basic water service. By 2030, we could see a 40% global decline in the supply of fresh water, even as demand for it skyrockets in sub-Saharan Africa. With world population growth expected to increase from 8 billion today to 9.7 billion by 2050 before tailing off later in this century, it's quite possible we'll be staring at an even more severe global water crisis than we have now. Before we get to my longer answer, I want to acknowledge the work of the New York Times for the incredible work it's done on this topic, which heavily influenced my research on this episode. Between 2023 and this year, the Times ran a series of long and detailed articles called Uncharted Waters about the causes and consequences of disappearing water, both in the U.S. and abroad. It's Pulitzer Prize level reporting, in my opinion, and I strongly encourage our listeners to check our Facebook page where I will post links to many of the articles in the series.
Yeah, okay.
All right. The headline of the Times series is that overuse is draining our country's water supply and threatens our economic prosperity and quality of life. The Native Americans who first settled our land and the colonists who came after them inherited a bounteous supply of underground water in the form of aquifers, water-bearing beds of permeable rock, gravel, or sand. The water typically sits between the rock and the soil. About half of the nation's water supply comes from aquifers, also known as groundwater. The other half collects in rivers, lakes, and reservoirs and is known as surface water. Most rural communities pump groundwater from private wells, while most cities rely on surface water delivered by utilities through public water systems. Groundwater in particular has been treated as an unlimited resource in our country, with entire local economies built around the assumption that their aquifers will never go dry. Though all sources of water are in crisis right now, I'm going to talk mostly about groundwater because that's where the crisis is most acute. The Times examined data on groundwater levels dating back to 1920 for more than 84,000 wells across the nation and found that nearly half have been severely depleted in the last 4 decades, as more water has been extracted than can be replenished naturally. In just the last 10 years, 40% of the monitored wells experienced all-time lows. Water loss is not as obvious to us as other natural phenomena exacerbated by climate change, like hurricanes, wildfires, and floods, but it's no less real. Perhaps that's why we don't talk about it as much, and it just occurred to me.
Yeah.
The aquifers being drained by sprawling cities and industrial-scale agriculture sit deep beneath impermeable layers of rock and clay and can take centuries or even millennia to replenish, if they recover at all. It's not as simple as relying on the next storm to restore what you pumped out. The damage from groundwater loss is already being felt almost everywhere in the U.S. Rivers once replenished by groundwater during dry seasons have shrunk into streams or disappeared entirely. In my home state of New York, the overpumping of wells threatens to contaminate the drinking water supply on Long Island, the birthplace of American suburbia. In the nation's breadbasket of Kansas, the major aquifer serving 2.6 million acres of land is no longer able to support industrial agriculture, threatening America's status as the world's preeminent food producer. In parts of desert states like Utah, Texas, and California, the foundations of buildings are starting to crack, roads are buckling, and fissures are opening in the earth because of overpumping. Overpumping contaminates coastal aquifers by accelerating saltwater intrusion, in which ocean water moves into the emptying freshwater aquifers, rendering the drinking water either brackish or downright unhealthy. Things have gotten so bad in Norfolk, Virginia, that the authorities are doing what was previously unthinkable, pumping treated wastewater into the aquifer at great cost to arrest the falling water levels and serve as a barrier against saltwater intrusion. Similar water recycling projects have quadrupled over the past 2 decades. And if that's not enough to fret about, the emptying of aquifers releases into the water supply naturally occurring arsenic that's normally trapped in clay soil but gets jostled and released by overpumping. Researchers have already found increased levels of arsenic in California and Colorado, which are probably the canaries in the proverbial coal mine. Though we have technology to filter out arsenic from water, it works only when you're aware of the contamination in the first place. Since many wells are privately owned and not regulated, some homeowners may not even know about the introduction of arsenic to their drinking water.
I have to say, so far, you're painting a pretty bleak picture, Joe.
Yes.
I hope there's a happy ending to the story, though I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, and it gets bleaker still, but I will come around to some encouraging signs near the end, so stick with us. Keep the razors in the closet. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, just over 1/3 of the nation's drinking water comes from groundwater sources. The drinking water in rural communities is disproportionately groundwater because it's cheaper and easier to have a well than to treat and transport surface water through public water systems. The University of Tulsa's Waregia Bowman, a law professor and expert on water use, told the Times that as groundwater aquifers get depleted, quote, there will be parts of the U.S. that run out of drinking water, end quote. Which parts of the U.S., you ask? Well, we've talked on this podcast about the continuing migration of Americans to Sunbelt states. Many burgeoning cities are among the hottest and driest places in the country. In the metro area surrounding Phoenix, one of the nation's fastest growing cities, the state of Arizona curtailed some new home construction because there isn't enough groundwater in the aquifers. Many Arizona homeowners are digging deeper wells to find whatever water is left. if and when we have a drinking water crisis, it'll likely start in the desert.
Yeah. Not so long ago, Sonia and I were considering if we were to move out of Seattle, which areas would we consider? And for a brief moment there, I was looking at Albuquerque in New Mexico, which has a lot of things going for it. But the one doubt that I could not chase was that, what happens if the water runs out?
Yeah.
Because there's really no solution to that problem. And so cross that one off my list, but, add that to the list of communities that are certainly facing this.
Yeah. And it's kind of a wonder to me why more people don't have that thought process that you just described. People are just streaming down to the Sun Belt. I mean, we discussed this in our climate refugees episode, and I predicted then that that's going to change and there will be a reverse exodus, but it hasn't happened yet, and I still wonder why. Okay, as I mentioned a minute ago, one of the side effects of the overconsumption of groundwater is that the earth starts to crack and fall in. In Arizona alone, sinkholes, or earth fissures as they're alternately called, cover more than 3,000 square miles, but they occur in other states too, among them Utah and Florida. The Arizona Geological Survey describes earth fissures as, quote, pervasive cracks associated with extensive groundwater withdrawal, an anthropogenic geologic hazard that threatens people, property, infrastructure, and livestock, end quote. The Time series analyzed our country's 28 largest population centers and found that all but 3 of them are sinking, in some cases significantly. For example, Texas officials say that the double whammy of oil extraction and the overpumping of groundwater caused some land in the Houston area to sink by more than 10 feet over the last few decades. Phoenix experienced an astonishing 18 feet of elevation drop between the 1950s and 1990s. I checked New York City and Seattle, and they're also sinking, though not nearly as much. The East Coast is sinking by centimeters every decade. Each inch the land sinks closer to the water table greatly intensifies the damage from floods. And keep in mind that once the settling land fills in the gap where the aquifer once was, a phenomenon known as subsidence, that aquifer can no longer hold as much water. In many cases, it's irreversibly destroyed. The U.S. Geological Survey reports that subsidence already affects more than 47,000 square miles of waterways and land across the country, a number that's likely to grow by leaps and bounds in the years to come. Subsidence plus sea level rise from climate change, which NASA estimates at about 3.3 millimeters per year since the early 1990s and likely to accelerate in the future, is a scary combination. Is it any wonder we've been hearing about so many 100-year or 500-year floods recently? Federalism plays a role in this story in that there's almost no federal regulation of water, which is instead overseen by a patchwork of loose and short-sighted state rules. In California, where produce farmers are overpumping at least 76 of the state's aquifers, water use laws amount to a seniority-based use-it-or-lose-it system that dates back to the gold rush and ensures priority access to surface water and groundwater for farmers and ranchers. The Golden State didn't even begin restricting its use of groundwater in any meaningful way until the 2010s. A few states, including Missouri, Texas, and Colorado, allow for the unlimited pumping of groundwater until it's gone. In Texas, whoever owns land owns the water beneath that land and can claim a tax deduction for using their water for irrigation. In Minnesota, farmers self-report their use of groundwater, which in a time of scarcity incentivizes outright fraud, as in 2021, when, during a drought, large farms exceeded groundwater pumping limits by at least 6.1 billion gallons. Other states make exceptions for water-intensive lawns, gardens, and industrial agriculture, to which I say, If you're exempting all the biggest water users, is your rule even worth the paper it's printed on? In Montana, domestic wells are exempted from the standard permitting process, a loophole that allows developers to build single homes and subdivisions without considering the local water situation. As one expert put it, all those wells dug into the local aquifer is like having 50,000 straws in the same drink.
And what seems to be underpinning most of this, possibly all of it, is just the assumption that water is infinite, that we can just assume that the water gods will provide no matter how much we drink, how much we pump and irrigate. And therefore, any regulation is just sort of by the board, because why would you regulate something that's infinite? If you have a certain theological outlook on things, then maybe you think God will provide. But outside of that framework, I don't see how you can have anything other than concern.
Yeah. And the good news here is that the comprehension of water as a finite resource is finally hitting. And I'll get to that after I finish my tale of all the woes of the water crisis. Some states like Oklahoma keep tabs on the water supply in its aquifers, but are ambivalent about making such data public for fear of backlash from residents concerned that it will adversely affect their property values. Ignorance seems to be another through line. Some states don't even know how much water they have or where it's located. Indeed, one reason why regulation is so lacking is because groundwater was so little understood for so long. As recently as the early 20th century, there were court rulings referring to the movement of groundwater as, quote, secret, occult, and concealed, end quote, and shrouded by, quote, hopeless uncertainty, end quote. What federal regulation of water does exist is scattered across several agencies and doesn't include explicit guidelines about overuse or depletion, even though Congress has the authority to make such rules. The data we glean from federal sources is sobering. Using satellites that measure subtle changes in gravity, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory tracks groundwater changes from space, and its data shows the sharp decline of major aquifers in Arizona, California, and in the gigantic Ogallala Aquifer located under eastern Colorado, Kansas, and the Panhandle regions of Texas and Oklahoma, which irrigates much of the global food supply. In parts of Oklahoma, the Ogallala Aquifer is dozens of feet lower than it was in the 1950s. President Biden's 2021 infrastructure law increased spending for water recycling and storage and for desalination programs that might reduce the demand for groundwater. But the director of Columbia University's Water Center described the overall regulatory environment as, quote, a total mess, end quote. The lack of centralized coordination results in penny-wise, pound-foolish practices, like the frenzied over-reliance on groundwater in places like Phoenix, or the cultivation of water-intensive crops like cotton in dry areas. With no federal role, the parochial economic interests of states and large corporations are elevated above science or public interest. As one researcher told the Times, quote, hydrology should drive the rules and regulations, not state borders, end quote. Climate change contributes to water loss in a few ways. It amplifies surface water depletion by shrinking the snowpack whose annual melting feeds rivers, thus forcing many communities to rely more heavily on groundwater to make up the shortfall. Many areas of the country receive much less precipitation than they used to. Rising temperatures also mean that more surface water evaporates or is absorbed by bone-dry topsoil, leaving less to replenish aquifers and less for homeowners' lawns and farmers' crops at a time when they require more water to counteract the increasing heat. The pumping of groundwater to irrigate crops became widespread with the improvements in pump technology after World War II. Before that, farmers relied on surface water sources like rainfall or nearby rivers. The post-war boom turned the Plains states into an agricultural colossus of corn, wheat, sorghum, soybeans, and alfalfa, with crop yields above and beyond what was supportable by surface water. That, plus the care and maintenance of our number one crop, the green lawns we examined in episode 114, led to the extraction of way more groundwater than could be put back. Let's drill down on corn for a minute because it's emblematic of the larger issue. Indeed, the economic cost of our water crisis can be measured in corn cobs, with yields having already peaked in most places. For example, Wichita County, Kansas, topped 170 bushels of corn per acre in the late 1990s, but now generates only 70 bushels, on a par with output in the 1960s. In places like Kansas, where corn is king, the center pivot irrigation system, that seemingly endless revolving metal sprinkler contraption on wheels that's been ubiquitous for the last half century, used to pump out hundreds of gallons of well water per minute, 24 hours a day, for weeks or even months on end during the growing season. Such intensive irrigation techniques more than doubled the corn yield per acre, but they proved to be unsustainable. Today, as the wells go dry, there are fewer center pivots dispensing less and less water, leading to the erasure of decades of gains in corn yields. One other thing about corn before we move on. You may have read that the airline industry is keen to power its jets with ethanol to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, ethanol comes from corn, and it takes hundreds of gallons of water to produce a single gallon of ethanol, which is just a reminder that even the quote-unquote good energy sources can have their own environmental costs. Just like EV batteries require the mining of rare metals and minerals, a so-called sustainable biofuel like ethanol places further strain on groundwater reserves.
Yeah. And just like that carton of almond milk in my refrigerator is a black mark on my soul because of all the water that it takes to get a crop of almonds ready for market.
Yes. It isn't just the obvious breadbasket regions that are suffering from overpumping. Maryland has seen water levels drop in nearly 75% of its monitored wells in the last 4 decades. In Oregon, it's 2/3. Charles County in the D.C. suburbs has used up most of its groundwater and is starting to look at things like desalinizing river water or piping in water from elsewhere. Both options are prohibitively expensive and might increase costs by a factor of 10. Some farmers believe they can adapt to the new normal of groundwater scarcity by using more efficient irrigation and land management techniques, or by exploiting recent advances in plant genetics. But experts quoted by the Times said the efficiencies created by new technologies won't be enough to turn the tide, with one saying, quote, "The loss of water is going to outpace the gain of technology. Eventually, we're going to lose," end quote. With drier conditions causing the practice of using groundwater to irrigate crops to move inexorably eastward, aquifer depletion threatens the future of all American farming. So as we've heard, agriculture is a major culprit in this tale, but it's not the only one. We've talked about how the data centers that power the development of AI technology suck up electricity. But did you know that they're also heavy users of water?
Yeah, to cool the processors.
That's right.
Because processors, as they move electrons around, get very hot. And if they get too hot, they burn out and you have to replace them.
Exactly.
So cooling those centers is a real problem.
Yep. To cool all those supercomputers, enormous amounts of water are piped in. For example, a data center built by Meta in Georgia last year uses about 500,000 gallons of water per day, and neighboring residents are getting little to no water pressure from their private wells. The new wave of AI-specific data centers are expected to use millions of gallons per day. America's changing dietary habits also contribute to groundwater depletion. Did you know, Mark, that Americans today eat more than double the amount of chicken and cheese that they did when we were kids in the 1970s?
I didn't know that. I feel like I might be personally responsible for a big chunk of that because I eat a lot of chicken and cheese. So you are pointing the finger of blame directly at me with that remark.
Yeah, so feeding all those additional chickens and cows requires tons of corn, soybeans, and alfalfa, much of it grown in places like Idaho, which is known for its potatoes, but now supports a robust dairy industry. Idaho's Magic Valley gets only 10 inches of rain a year and relies on groundwater to grow alfalfa, which is a particularly water-intensive crop. Arkansas is ground zero for America's chicken industry. More than half the state's water usage is devoted to the corn, soybeans, and other feed required for poultry operations. Arkansas also produces half the country's rice, yet another water-intensive crop. All told, the state pumps more than twice as much groundwater from its aquifers as rainfall restores. And just for clarity, beef remains the most water-intensive food, but its use has plateaued in recent years, while chicken use has skyrocketed. And then there's fracking, the creation of oil and gas wells from the hydraulic fracturing of bedrock, which requires, you guessed it, mind-boggling amounts of water. Since 2011, American fracking operations have used almost 1.5 trillion with a T gallons of water. Their annual water use is expected to rise as the Trump administration doubles down on fossil fuels and new water-intensive techniques are developed. Texas is the fracking capital of America. And despite the extreme heat and climate change-related droughts that have beset the state in recent years, the big oil companies engaged in fracking require no permits to drill their own wells, nor are there even consistent rules guiding their reporting of groundwater use. Fracking is basically exempted from water use restrictions. To make matters worse, the fracking process, which involves injecting toxic chemicals, contaminates the groundwater, removing it from the natural water cycle. And only 15% of that contaminated water is recycled for further fracking operations. The states engaged in fracking have slowly begun to catch up and impose greater restrictions. But treating all that wastewater is expensive, and we've yet to see if environmental concerns will triumph over the profit motive in the end. Very doubtful in Texas, I would say. Local politics plays a pivotal role in water allocation. In Nevada, the largest gold mine in North America pulled 3.4 billion gallons of water out of aquifers in 2022, not to use for agriculture or for drinking, but to process the excavated ore and keep its pits and mine shafts dry. When the state considered legislation making it harder to get permits to pump water, a committee of legislators, all of whom had received campaign contributions from the mining company, killed the legislation, even though groundwater levels near the mine have dropped by hundreds of feet in the past 2 decades. Worldwide, the picture is about the same. A Times analysis of 1,700 aquifers in over 40 countries since 2000 found that groundwater levels have fallen in almost half of them. Only about 7% showed rising levels of groundwater in that period. The declines are happening in most of the places I mentioned, like the Plains states and California's Central Valley, but also in places like Iran. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. So this sounds like a crisis, doesn't it, Mark?
Yes, it sounds like a crisis that's on fire, barreling down the tracks with no brakes.
Yeah, I agree with you, and so do the experts. So the question becomes, what can we do about it? First, I want to report some data that illustrates that it's not all bad. A study published in the journal Nature took a look at places where water levels are recovering. Recovery is happening all over the globe, from Australia to China to Saudi Arabia to Spain, Thailand, and South Africa, and yes, in the United States too. Just as groundwater decline is explained by a variety of reasons that I just rattled off, groundwater recovery also has multiple explanations, including beefed up regulations, the diversion of river water to replenish aquifers, and reclaimed wastewater and rainwater runoff from rooftops. As the evidence of groundwater depletion mounts and the recognition grows locality by locality that the water supply is in crisis, things are beginning to change. Nebraska regulators created 23 natural resources districts that enforce stricter rules when aquifer levels drop. In southwest Kansas, where the aquifers are at dangerously low levels, legislation passed in 2023 forcing water districts to better protect their aquifers. The intrepid legislators bucking the cloud of big lobbies and deep-pocketed donors to push through such bills have voiced concern about whether state regulators, themselves political appointees, will enforce the new laws. One California activist admitted, quote, "We can't fix it without stepping on toes," end quote. That's why some experts believe the federal government's role vis-a-vis water conservation should be like that of the EPA vis-a-vis water quality, setting minimum requirements for groundwater conservation, then stepping in if states fail or refuse to enforce those requirements. Up until now, federal officials have been reluctant to get involved in that way. Representative Jared Huffman of California, who used to manage a water district and also worked as an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, characterized water use as, quote, "a hot stove they don't want to touch," end quote, mainly because people think of the water under their land as, quote, "this domain of individual liberty that nobody wants the federal government or even the states to have authority over," end quote. Huffman added that, quote, "it just has to get really bad before something like that happens," end quote. It's apparently bad enough in the Pajaro Valley along the coast of Monterey Bay in California for local officials to try a cutting-edge solution that just might work. The Pajaro Valley is a land dotted with strawberry, raspberry, and blackberry fields. Its groundwater was so badly overpumped that by the 1980s, the saltwater intrusion I described earlier had damaged the berry crop enough for growers to form their own water agency to fix the problems and find a way to disincentivize the practice. Today, in order to get access to irrigation water to cultivate those crops, growers must pay hefty fees per acre foot, which is a standard measurement of water covering 1 acre, 1 foot deep. It's basically a tax on groundwater, and the revenue it generates is used to capture rainwater as well as conserve, recycle, and restore the region's groundwater. Despite people's aversion to taxes, this one appears to be changing behavior. The 20% increase in the price of groundwater has resulted in a 20% decrease in groundwater extraction. And despite the new tax making it one of the most expensive places in the country to grow food, agriculture in the Pajaro Valley is thriving. Perhaps because the impacted companies understand the big picture. Soren Bjorn, CEO of Driscoll's, the world's largest supplier of berries, said of the pricing scheme, quote, "We can't get away with producing something for which the resources do not exist. Water can't be free anywhere because you can't run a sustainable water supply without pricing it." End quote. The Pajaro Valley water managers report that they're getting calls from other parts of California about how to implement the water tax or similar measures in those localities. Now, it's true that the implementation of water taxes everywhere would mean higher food prices, and that may lead to farmers shifting away from growing water-intensive crops like corn or cotton. But if the alternative is running out of water, it's a price worth paying. As one of the Pajaro Valley farmers put it, quote, "The farmer has very little flexibility to build in the cost of water, so it means we have to price it into our product. But the pricing has allowed us to put in place the kind of measures that will help us have a sustainable system for the long term if we want to keep the resource." End quote. Another thing we can do is to expand the treatment of wastewater to augment the water supply in aquifers, as I mentioned was already being done in Virginia. A big advantage of using wastewater is that there's an endless and reliable supply of it. Texas and California are refining plans to build out what used to be derisively referred to as toilet-to-tap systems, and many other states are bound to follow. One water usage expert described it as, quote, "closing the loop on the urban water cycle," end quote. To sum up, I'd say that water scarcity poses more of a risk to global food security and health outcomes in the short to medium term than it does to humanity's long-term survival. Diminished yields of those water-intensive crops I mentioned could lead to disruptions in the food supply and higher prices. We may see food shortages in unexpected places, including some parts of the United States and Europe where poor and food-insecure people already live. The reduced availability of water might lead to inadequate sanitation, which increases the risk of waterborne diseases like cholera. Drought impacts not only food security but also air quality, which became vividly true for millions of Americans when dust and smoke from wildfires blanketed our skies in recent summers, worsening respiratory problems for people with asthma. All told, it's an enormously complicated and expensive web of problems to solve, and that's before you include the infrastructure damage caused by subsidence, the collapsed roads, bridges, and buildings. It's obvious that we will need to innovate our way out of these problems, but I'm confident we can and will. New and better regulations, the sustainable management of water systems, and increased water conservation via rainwater harvesting and the reuse of treated wastewater will help to slowly replenish our aquifers. But there's also the prospect of alternatives to fresh water. And I'm not talking about milk or soda. I briefly mentioned desalination a couple of times in this presentation. It's the process of removing dissolved salt and minerals from seawater, which comprises nearly 97% of the world's water. And I suspect it's going to play a major role in this story. Today, desalination is mostly used in the Middle East, where energy is abundant but fresh water is scarce. There are multiple existing ways to desalinate seawater, including filtration, boiling, reverse osmosis, in which a filter removes salt from the water, and electrodialysis, in which an electric current removes salt ions. They're all expensive and energy intensive, and they produce a salty brine wastewater that poses some disposal challenges. But new technologies are being developed, like one in which floating ocean buoys use emission-free wave power instead of electricity to pump seawater through reverse osmosis filters. The newly fresh water is then piped ashore by the natural motion of waves. There's another solar-powered system in which specialized membranes direct salt ions into a stream of brine, resulting in fresh, drinkable water. These cheaper, cleaner technologies can potentially be scaled up to meet the needs of a thirsty world.
Quick question, and maybe your research didn't cover this, but let's imagine a future in which that seawater conditioning program that you described, with the emission-free, wave-powered approach is widespread. Would there be any environmental impact in effectively increasing the concentration of salt, at least within local areas, on the local sea life? It seems like we might just be transferring the impact from one part of the economy to the other by, on a large scale, pulling water out of the ocean and leaving the salt behind. Or is there no scientific basis to that?
No, I think that is a very real concern, and it has historically been the reason why desalination has been kind of disfavored among ways to improve the water crisis. But, much as we just discussed, where are we going to put all the nuclear waste if we revive nuclear, we're going to find places to put it, We're going to put it underground. We're going to put it in safe containers that can't be breached. I think the same thing is possible with salt. Unless some genius finds another way to repurpose excess salt that leads to other breakthroughs. Overall, it's not something I think that should inhibit us from trying the new technology.
Yeah. We might not have any choice, and you're right.
Okay, I want to close with one last idea that I admit was not in any of the pieces I read for my research. If worst comes to worst, there is one other alternative to drinking water that we might need to put on the table. It's cheap and easy to produce, and it's environmentally sound because it involves recycling. I'm a big fan of Bear Grylls, the British adventurer who hosted the TV series Man vs. Wild for several years. In that show, he often found himself in situations where he was facing dehydration without a source of potable water, and he always survived. I'll let him explain how he did it.
I've been dropped into the Kimberley in North Australia. I'm heading northwest towards the coast, trying to make my way back to civilization. But now I'm getting low on water.
And the only thing I can do is to drink my own pee. And this is something I've never done before. And I'm expecting it to be pretty horrible. But I need to keep those fluids going in.
It may seem disgusting, but your own urine is safe to drink.
God, there's no getting away from it. That really is pretty horrible. It's like warm and it's salty. Not my favourite.
Yes, mansplaining listeners, we have it in us, quite literally, to solve the water crisis. It's not ideal, but it's better than Mountain Dew.
There's your marketing slogan right there, Joe. Piss brands, bottled water. The slogan underneath, not ideal, but better than Mountain Dew. Oh, yeah. That video was hard to watch. I was vicariously experiencing what it would be like to have warm pee sliding down my throat, and I hope I never experience that. I hope I'm never in that situation. But it does remind me of a story from my past, which is I used to work at a place that put a lot of pride into how environmentally responsible the building it was in, which was custom built was. And one of those is that rainwater would be captured on the roof and used for things like, flushing the toilets. But someone thought that it was a good idea to put up a sign above every toilet in the restroom saying, "Not potable water." So you'd go in there, you'd go into the toilet stall, and every time you'd see a sign telling you not to drink the water from the toilet. And I remember thinking at the time, if the circumstances of the day had brought me to the point of drinking water directly from a toilet, I was probably not going to care what the sign had to say.
Yes, and maybe that sign should have been put on the sink and not the toilet, right?
Yes, that would have been better.
Yeah, so obviously I jest at the end of this episode, and I did present more negatives than positives here, and yet, strangely, I feel like this is another problem that we're going to be able to innovate our way out of, and I wonder whether you agree, hearing everything I just presented.
I do think the problem will be solved, but I think I'd put solved in quotation marks there because I don't think it's going to be great for everybody. I think the most likely outcome is that drinking water is going to become expensive instead of basically free at this point. I think the water bill that we all pay currently is going to go up significantly. And as always, those effects are going to be borne most heavily by the people who are least in the position to deal with it. The people who are already leading marginal lives are going to be the ones most impacted. And that just seems to be the conditions we live in within this capitalist society, is that the only effective driver of change is when things get more expensive, that we cannot rally public sentiment around a common good. All we can do is make it more expensive. And if it's more expensive, then you drive behavior changes. If the cost is low or stays the same, then behavior doesn't change. And, that's a little discouraging, but it's very much consistent with our experience. So I suppose it's what's to be expected.
Yeah, I can't argue with that logic. All I would say is, however many billions of people exist on the earth in the near to far future, they will need to drink water and therefore will need to be available to them. I'm not sure the same can and should be said about fracking. I feel like maybe the initial step will be water gets expensive for everybody, but at some point people are going to become energized and politicized by this issue. And that's when people power is going to tell our legislators that fracking is not a logical use of limited water supplies, and growing rice in Arkansas is maybe not the best use of limited resources, and we need to be a lot smarter about the way we grow our food and use our water so that people can drink it ultimately.
Yeah, well, I hope that's true. This does seem like such a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons.
Yes.
Right? Which was a concept that I think we dealt with in some depth within the NIMBY episode.
Yes.
If you go back in our archives, where this is a problem that's exacerbated by people pursuing individual benefit, and the cost is borne by the community as a whole.
Yes.
And the reason that there's a specific term for that is those situations are particularly hard to eradicate, particularly in a society like ours, which is so much founded on the ideology, almost the mythology of individual rights, where you mentioned like my land, my water, you're not going to tell me what to do with it. That's so core to who we are as a country that really you would need a very strong legislative effort backed up by, in some cases, police presence to get people to get out of the mindset that they can do whatever the hell they please with the well that they've dug within their land. It's a mindset thing that's it's really can be an obstacle to serious change until, like you say, water becomes so expensive that the public opinion shifts dramatically in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a perfect illustration of that concept. I keep coming back in my own head to centralized authority and regulation. And unfortunately, we're in a period of time right now in politics where regulation is disfavored and the know-nothings are in control and they're hell-bent on dismantling regulations. But ultimately, I think the way to encourage people to do the right thing is through adequate and comprehensive regulation, especially of public goods. So I think I didn't mention this as one of the solutions, but the central government's taking more authority in the regulation of water, both in the United States and abroad, is another piece of this solution. And it's inevitable that that's going to happen.
Okay. Well, thank you for this. Add declining water tables to the list of really concerning risks that we've explored within this podcast to go along with climate change and runaway AI and all the other things, the calamitous scenarios that we seem to be confronting one after the other as a society. I wonder if this is the sort of thing that people went through all the time in the past, like one thing after another, where they're wondering like, oh my gosh, how are we going to deal with this? Like, were people worrying about that sort of thing in the 1930s and the 40s, the 50s? Or is this a particularly modern thing? Like, do we have more of these things now than we used to have? Or is it just within our own frame of reference? It seems like we're dealing with more, and yet people have always worried about stuff for as long as there's been people.
Yeah, I guess my hot take on that is that there were just as many things to worry about 50 or 100 years ago. We just didn't have social media and podcasts and the internet to blast every frickin' problem in the world into our ears every day. You know, that's my feeling.
Yeah, that is 100% true, but a little ironic, seeing as how we are currently recording a podcast to blast this concern into people's ears.
Yes.
So,
we're part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution.
Ideally. Yeah. Fingers crossed. But you have a question for me for next time?
Yes, I do have a question for you, and it's a less calamitous issue, I'm happy to report. My wife and I recently returned from a vacation in which we spent some time doing genealogical research about her mother's family. And that research took us to a few cemeteries in central and western Ohio, where we located the graves of several of her ancestors. All the cemeteries we visited were very clean and well-maintained, with neatly mowed green lawns stretching out in every direction and security officers on patrol. But one thing they all lacked was visitors. We could count on the fingers of two hands the total number of people we saw in all the cemeteries combined. And that got us thinking about cemeteries generally and prompted these questions for you. How are cemeteries economically viable? Who pays for all that landscaping and upkeep? And is there even a demand for graveyards anymore, as the older ones run out of space while more and more people opt for cremation?
Yeah, that's interesting. I look forward to getting into the economics of the mortuary industry and figuring out, where things are changing and where they'll maybe stay the same.
Yeah. And the fate of the world doesn't rely on this issue getting solved, but it's going to be an interesting exploration for us, I suspect.
So I shall be thinking about death and the dead over the next few weeks. Our listeners might be sipping on a cool glass of water in hot weather while they're doing that, though hopefully thinking about where that water came from. Was it from a surface water source or was it from groundwater? Examine those things, dear listener, and as Socrates would say, lead a more examined life.
And I will do just that by following Bear Grylls' advice and making myself part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Hopefully not recording yourself and doing it. Okay, with that image once again in our minds, thanks to Joe, we'll leave you for now. I'm Mark. That was the urine-obsessed Joe, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
When you comes from snow. It's precious, we can't grow it, so we best not blow it. You see that empty well? Who's the dim-witted dumbbell? You see all those sinkholes? They're caused by selfish a-holes. Holy smoker! It's the precious water polka. Holy smoker! It's the life-giving water polka. Holy smoker! It's the precious water polka. Holy smoker! It's the life-giving water polka. Know it!
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.